If you walk into a forest today and you step on just a random patch of dirt, there is this incredibly popular, like really beautiful scientific theory that says you didn't just step on soil, you stepped on a biological internet.
Yeah, subterranean cooperative network, the Wood Wide Web.
Exactly. The idea that trees are, talking to each other, sharing carbon, sending out warning signals through these tiny fungal cables. And if you look up at the oldest tree in the grove, the popular narrative tells you that it's this, like mother tree, right?
Yeah.
Actively nursing her offspring through this underground web.
It is a concept that has just fundamentally rewired our relationship with the natural world over, really the last 2 decades.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's everywhere now.
Right, because we stopped looking at forests as these gladiator arenas where trees fiercely compete in a zero-sum battle for sunlight and nutrients, and we started viewing them as utopian communities.
Yeah.
It just completely humanized forest ecology for people.
But what happens when an entire scientific field realizes its most famous, most universally beloved story might actually be built on, painted wood instead of steel cables?
That's the big question.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a massive stack of sources today. We're talking peer-reviewed audits, biological critiques, and some remarkably passionate rebuttals, all documenting this huge 2023 scientific reckoning.
Yeah, a group of ecologists basically decided to rigorously stress test the Wood Wide Web, and what they found triggered an absolute earthquake in the scientific community.
And whether you're a student trying to learn how scientific consensus actually evolves, or you just love a good science documentary, you need to care about this, because this deep dive is really a masterclass in how to navigate evolving truths in public media,
It really is, and the stakes here are just fascinating.
Right. It's a story about how good science self-corrects and why wonder requires discipline.
And we should set some ground rules right up front, I
They
think.
do.
Because we are not looking at a scandal here. This is not a story about fraud or malicious intent. We're just taking an objective, even-handed look at a real live scientific controversy that's playing out right now.
Yeah, nobody's the bad guy here.
Exactly. We will examine the critics who found these surprising gaps in the field data and the original proponents who are vigorously defending decades of their life's work. We are not picking winners today. We're just unpacking the mechanics of how good science self-corrects.
Right. To understand why this 2023 audit hit the ecology world so hard, we have to understand the sheer gravity of the narrative it was audited.
Oh, the narrative was huge.
I mean, for most of the 20th century, the dominant paradigm in forestry was basically agricultural, right?
Yeah.
Silviculture treated forests like crop fields.
Yeah, you measure a forest in board feet.
Exactly. Trees are just independent pillars of timber. You clear cut the valuable ones, you plant a monoculture of saplings, you thin out the weak, and you harvest again.
The prevailing wisdom was entirely Darwinian. Competition was like the sole defining driver of forest architecture. If a tree was tall, it was just because it successfully outcompeted its neighbors for resources.
But the cracks in that purely competitive model started to show in the late 1990s. And that culminates in this landmark 1997 paper published in the journal Nature by Suzanne Simard and her colleagues.
The 1997 paper is really where the magic begins. Simard demonstrated something completely revolutionary. She showed carbon physically moving between Douglas fir and paper birch seedlings.
Which is wild.
Right. And the proposed highway for this carbon transfer was the Common Mycorrhizal Network, or CMN.
Okay, let's dig into the actual cellular biology of this for a second, because the physical mechanism is just incredible. How does a tree actually hook up to a fungus?
Well, the process is an ancient symbiosis. The word mycorrhizal actually translates to fungus root. So when a tree seed sprouts, these fungal threads in the soil called hyphae.
Which are microscopic, right?
Yeah, microscopic tubular structures. They colonize the young roots. And depending on the type of fungus, these hyphae might weave this intricate sheath around the root tip, which is known as a Hardig net.
Okay.
Or they might actually penetrate the root's cortical cells, forming these highly branched tree-like structures inside the cell called arbuscules.
So you have this, direct physical interface between the plant tissue and the fungal tissue. Like, they're literally fused.
Precisely. It's a chemical trading floor. The tree uses photosynthesis to pull carbon dioxide from the air, right, and manufacture sugars.
Because the tree has leaves in the sun and the fungus doesn't.
Exactly. The fungus cannot photosynthesize, so it desperately needs that carbon to survive. So the tree passes a significant portion of those carbon-rich sugars down into its root cells and just hands them over to the fungus.
And what does the tree get out of this deal?
In exchange, the fungus sends its hyphae radiating out into the soil. And because fungal hyphae are magnitudes thinner than plant roots, they can squeeze into microscopic soil pores that the roots just can't reach.
Oh, wow. So they're scavenging.
Yes, they scavenge water, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and then they shuttle all that back up to the tree.
Okay, so that's the basic trade. But the leap from a single tree trading with a fungus to an entire forest acting as a superorganism that relies on the idea that these fungal hyphae don't just stop at one tree.
Right.
They extend through the soil and colonize a neighboring tree and then another, creating this physically continuous conduit, the common mycorrhizal network.
And the implications of that continuous network upended everything.
How so?
Well, if tree A and tree B are plugged into the exact same fungal individual, the 1997 paper suggested they weren't just hoarding their own capital, they were actually trading it across the network.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where it turns into an underground internet, complete with routers and data packets. Over the next 25 years, that initial discovery snowballs into a massive cultural phenomenon.
Oh, huge. It peaked with Simard's 2021 best-selling memoir, Finding the Mother Tree.
Right, and the claims moved way, way beyond simple carbon transfer. The popular narrative, which ended up in TED Talks and these high-end documentaries, posited that trees actively balance the needs of the forest.
Yeah, we were told that dying trees purposefully dump their remaining carbon into the network to provision their neighbors before they pass.
Or that trees send chemical warnings of insect attacks down the fungal line. It's like, hey guys, aphids over here, prep your defenses.
Exactly. And the emotional climax of this narrative was the concept of the mother tree.
Right, the grandmothers of the forest.
These were identified as the oldest, largest, most highly connected hubs in the forest. And the public storytelling suggested these giant elders possessed a form of kin recognition.
Like they actually knew who their kids were.
Right, that they could supposedly identify their own biological offspring in the dark understory and preferentially route extra resources through the fungal web to ensure their specific babies survived.
That is just, I mean, think about the immense moral vocabulary that narrative gave to conservationists. You aren't just logging a mature timber stock anymore. You are assassinating a mother who is actively nursing her children. It completely shifted public perception.
It did. It gave people a profound reason to care.
But, and here's my question for you. If the underlying science of mycorrhizal symbiosis is real, which it clearly is, how much of this specific popular story was actually proven in the field? Because science demands that we separate the cultural utility of a story from the empirical data supporting it.
And that's exactly where the pressure on the underlying data was mounting. The public was happily digesting this utopian vision of forest ecology, but inside the academic community, murmurs of skepticism were really growing.
Because scientists were trying to prove it and struggling.
Yeah. Field ecologists trying to replicate these massive systemic behaviors were encountering highly messy, contradictory results.
Which brings us to the tipping point.
Yeah.
The 2023 audit. The skepticism finally coalesced on February 13th, 2023, with a paper published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution.
Right. Authored by 3 researchers, Justine Karst, Melanie D. Jones, and Jason D. Hoeksema.
And they decided to formally audit the Wood Wide Web, and their methodology was kind of brutal in its simplicity, honestly. They didn't go out and run one new experiment in a single forest, right?
No, they conducted a massive aggregate review. They gathered decades of peer-reviewed literature and tested the core claims of the popular narrative against the aggregate data.
Which is super important. Aggregate reviews are essential for checking the temperature of a scientific consensus. You can't just rely on one flashy paper.
Exactly. Karst and her colleagues systematically categorized the findings of all these studies. They were asking a fundamental question. Does the published field data actually support the claims being made in best-selling books and documentaries?
So let's start with the most basic premise they tested: ubiquity. The popular story assumes that common mycorrhizal networks are everywhere.
Right, that anywhere you walk in a forest, you are standing on a connected tree-to-tree web.
But when the reviewers looked for studies that actually proved this in the wild, what did they find?
They found that the ubiquity was overwhelmingly assumed rather than mapped.
Assumed, not mapped.
Right, because mapping a microscopic fungal network in the dirt is an incredibly demanding task. You can't just dig up a clump of soil and look at it. To prove a continuous network exists between 2 trees, scientists have to use microsatellite genotyping.
Okay, let's break down microsatellite genotyping for a second, because this highlights the sheer difficulty of the science. It's essentially genetic fingerprinting, right?
Exactly. It relies on analyzing specific, repeating sequences of DNA. Because fungi of the same species look identical under a microscope.
So you can't just say, oh, these two white threads look the same. They must be the same organism.
No, not at all. If you find a fungal thread on the root of tree A and a fungal thread of the same species on tree B 10 feet away, you cannot assume they are connected. They could be two completely separate fungal individuals that just happen to belong to the same species.
Like two different humans standing in the same room. We're both human, but we aren't physically connected to each other.
Exactly. So to prove a connection, you have to prove that the thread on tree A and the thread on tree B share the exact same unique genetic fingerprint, proving they're literally the same physical organism stretching across the gap.
That sounds incredibly tedious.
It is, and the reviewers found that this rigorous standard of proof, actual mapped, genotyped continuity of fungal links between trees had only been successfully demonstrated in roughly 2 forest types.
Wait, two? Just 2 forest types in the whole world?
2 forest types, and involving only a tiny handful of tree species out of the tens of thousands that exist on Earth.
Wow. Okay, so the foundation starts to look incredibly narrow right out of the gate. The assumption that everywhere in the world trees are constantly forming these continuous networks was a massive extrapolation from a very small pool of hard evidence.
It was a massive leap.
But, okay, let's say the network is patchy. Even if it's not everywhere, the core of the popular story was that when the network is there, it acts as a life support system, right? It ferries resources to reliably benefit young seedlings.
Right, claim 2. And when Karst, Jones, and Hoeksema analyzed the field results regarding seedling benefits, the utopian narrative really fractured. The field data was highly variable.
Variable how?
The most commonly reported outcome wasn't a benefit to the seedling, it was a neutral effect.
Neutral. So the network connection did absolutely nothing measurable for the plant's survival or growth.
Nothing measurable.
Wait, if neutral effects were the most common outcome, how did researchers originally convince peer reviewers that the network was a massive support system? Did they just, ignore their own neutral data?
No, the data wasn't ignored, but ecology is deeply context-dependent. In a highly controlled greenhouse or in a very specific patch of deep shade in one type of forest, a researcher might measure a statistically significant benefit.
Okay, so it works under very specific conditions.
Right, but when you aggregate all the studies across different environments, that benefit washes out into neutrality. And furthermore, the review highlighted something the popular narrative entirely omitted. When there was an effect, it was roughly a 50-50 split between the network helping the seedling or the network actually stunting or hurting the seedling.
Hurting it? Wait, really? Like the fungus acting as a parasite?
Exactly. I mean, fungi are biological organisms prioritizing their own survival. They aren't altruistic charities.
Good point.
In certain soil conditions, a massive fungal network might demand more carbon from a small, struggling seedling than it returns in soil nutrients.
Oh, so it's taxing the baby tree to death.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Or plugging into a shared network might create a superhighway for soil pathogens to infect the young plant. The aggregate data painted a picture of a messy, competitive, highly context-dependent marketplace, not a guaranteed nursery.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because this brings us to the most jarring finding of the entire audit. Claim 3. The emotional core. The mother trees. The claim that large, old trees preferentially send resources and defense signals to their own biological kin through the network. When the critics looked for the published field evidence supporting directed, kin-preferential transfer in forests, what did they find?
They found zero.
Zero.
The critique was absolute on this point. There was no peer-reviewed, published field evidence demonstrating that a mature tree can recognize its offspring through a fungal network and consciously direct resources to them.
That is insane. I mean, the central pillar of the public phenomenon simply did not exist in the scientific literature. It's literally like finding out a beloved historical quote was never actually spoken.
It was a huge shock to people outside the specific subfield. The critics were formally stating that the public narrative had run dangerously ahead of the evidence.
And this matters immensely for real-world application, right? Because if forest managers build logging policies on the assumption that leaving a few mother trees in a clear cut will magically sustain new saplings via a fungal internet.
And that internet doesn't actually work that way.
Right. They could end up collapsing the very ecosystem they're trying to manage. But the immediate question this raises for me is, how did a field of rigorous scientists end up producing studies that supported such an overblown narrative in the first place?
To understand that, we have to examine the physical tools researchers use to study the subterranean world. We have to look at the method artifacts.
Okay, this is where the detective story really kicks in, because this is so practical. Imagine you are a field ecologist. You want to prove that two trees are sharing nutrients exclusively through a microscopic fungal thread.
Right.
The problem is, dirt is just a chaotic soup of stuff. How do you know tree A isn't just leaking nutrients into the soil water and tree B is just soaking up that water with its own roots? You have to isolate the fungal conduit.
And for decades, the gold standard for isolating that conduit was the use of fine mesh barriers.
The mesh bags.
Yes. Researchers would dig a trench and plant a seedling surrounding its root system with a microscopic plastic mesh bag. The pores in this mesh were meticulously sized, usually around 35 micrometers.
Okay, 35 micrometers. Why that specific size?
The logic was that a 35 micrometer pore is too small for a thick plant root to grow through, but large enough to theoretically allow a microscopic fungal hypha to pass in and out.
Wow, on paper, that sounds like a brilliantly elegant experimental design. You block the plant roots from touching, you let the fungus bridge the gap through the mesh, and if the seedling inside the bag shows a sudden influx of carbon or nutrients from a neighboring tree, boom, the fungal network must be the delivery mechanism.
The logic seems airtight, absolutely, until you analyze the fluid dynamics and the microbial ecology of burying a plastic mesh bag in a forest floor.
Which is exactly what the Karst review did.
Right. They dedicated significant focus to what they called the mesh barrier problem. They argued that the tool used to measure the phenomenon was likely confounding the very results they were measuring.
Okay, so it's like trying to prove two rooms are sharing air through a tiny ventilation duct, but to isolate the duct, you hang a massive, heavy plastic tarp in the main doorway.
That's a perfect analogy.
If the temperature in the room changes, you don't know if it's because of the vent or because you just ruined the room's normal airflow with a giant piece of plastic. You don't know what you're actually measuring anymore.
Exactly. The mesh barrier is a highly disruptive tarp. When you cage a seedling's roots inside a 35 micrometer plastic mesh, you artificially restrict the volume of soil those roots can explore for their own nutrients.
Because they hit a wall.
Right. But more importantly, you fundamentally alter soil hydrology. Capillary action, the way water moves through the microscopic spaces between dirt particles, is severely disrupted by a plastic barrier.
Right.
Water might pool on one side of the mesh or drain too quickly on the other.
And if you change how water moves, you change the entire neighborhood for the microbes.
You completely change the microbial pooling. The altered moisture levels might inadvertently change which specific species of mycorrhizal fungi decide to colonize that patch of dirt.
Oh, wow.
It might create a barrier that keeps certain root-eating nematodes or pathogenic bacteria out while trapping others inside.
The implication there is just staggering. A researcher pulls up a seedling that was grown inside a mesh bag, sees that it grew, I don't know, 10% larger than a seedling without a bag, and publishes a paper concluding the fungal network boosted growth.
Exactly. And the critics are pointing out that the apparent network benefit might simply be an artifact of the plastic bag keeping root-eating bugs away or changing the local soil moisture. It is a textbook experimental confound.
That highlights the agonizing difficulty of studying living, interconnected systems in situ. You cannot put a forest in a sterile petri dish. Every single intervention creates ripples.
It does. But a physical confound in the soil is only the first step in how a scientific theory goes awry. The second step is how those potentially confounded results behave once they enter the academic literature.
Yes, the echo chamber. Because the 2023 review didn't just audit the dirt, they audited the bibliography.
They did.
They identified a massive echo chamber driven by positive citation bias. And I want to trace exactly how a thin, highly qualified observation morphs into an absolute biological law over a 25-year game of academic telephone.
Positive citation bias is a huge issue in science. It occurs when papers reporting affirmative or encouraging results are cited by subsequent researchers at a much higher rate than papers reporting neutral, negative, or inconclusive results.
And Karst, Jones, and Hoeksema documented this mathematically, right?
They did. When they analyzed popular summaries and subsequent literature reviews in this specific field, papers that claimed "we found a network connection" or "we found a benefit" were cited roughly twice as often as the ones with cautious or null findings.
2 to 1. That's a huge skew over time. Let's track a hypothetical example of this citation drift just to see how dangerous it is for students or anyone reading this stuff. Let's say in year 1, a scientist publishes a paper stating, under highly controlled artificial greenhouse conditions using mesh barriers, we observed a minor flux of carbon isotopes between two specific seedlings.
Okay. And they include all the caveats about the mesh bags
Right.
and the artificial setting in their discussion section.
Right. But then 5 years later, a different researcher writes a literature review. They cite that original paper, but they drop the caveats for the sake of brevity. So their summary reads, previous studies have shown that carbon moves between trees via fungal networks.
And then 10 years after that, a textbook author or a prominent ecologist writes a sweeping overview of forest dynamics. They cite the 5-year-old review paper, and the language escalates again.
Right. They write something like, forests are universally connected by carbon-sharing networks that redistribute resources from mature trees to young saplings.
Noom. The original highly constrained data point has been laundered through a decade of citations into a fundamental law of nature. The raw aggregate data out in the field might still be a messy 50-50 split of neutral and positive effects.
But a new graduate student entering the field and reading the most heavily cited papers will see a literature that looks like a 2-to-1 ratio in absolute favor of the utopian network.
The consensus they perceive is entirely artificial. It's driven by the popularity of the citations rather than the weight of the raw data.
And we have to talk about how the media acts as an extreme accelerant to this citation bias. Because we all want a good story.
Media loves certainty.
Exactly. The pressure from science journalism demands narrative, and it demands certainty. If I'm an editor at a major publication, a headline that reads, fungi have a highly context-dependent, often neutral effect on nearby seedlings subject to altered soil hydrology, is never going to see the light of day.
No one clicks on that.
Nobody. But a headline that reads, trees talk to each other and protect their young, that guarantees millions of clicks, book deals, and documentary features. The academic echo chamber feeds the media machine, and the media machine validates the academic echo chamber.
And so, when the Karst Review finally published these findings, the reaction in the popular science press was visceral. Outlets like Undark and Science Daily ran headlines asking where the Wood Wide Web went wrong and do trees really talk?
It appeared as though the entire paradigm had been dismantled overnight.
But the scientific method isn't a one-way street of demolition.
Right. The original researchers did not just roll over. The pioneers who spent their lives freezing in the mud to uncover these systems fired back with the ferocity that really makes this debate so compelling. We have to look at the defenders' counterattack because they bring rigorous, sophisticated methodology to the table. They didn't just get mad, they brought receipts.
They absolutely did. The first major countervolley came from a group led by Klein, along with Rog, Livno-Luzon, van der Heijden, and Kerner. Their paper was published across 2023 and 2024 in Open Research Europe, and the title was A Direct, Robust Rejoinder.
What was it?
Below-ground carbon transfer across mycorrhizal networks among trees. Facts, not fantasy.
Oh, wow. Facts, not fantasy. That is a line drawn in the sand right there.
It is. Klein's group argued that while the critics might quibble with the media's poetry, the core biological phenomenon below-ground carbon transfer is an undeniable, replicated fact.
And their primary weapon in proving this is isotope tracing, which entirely bypasses the mesh barrier problem we just talked about.
Exactly.
Let's walk step by step through an isotope tracing experiment in a real forest to understand why they are so confident. Because this is really cool science.
It's brilliant. Isotope tracing basically gives researchers a molecular tracking device. Carbon naturally occurs primarily as carbon-12, but scientists can obtain stable isotopes like carbon-13 or radioactive ones like carbon-14, which have different atomic masses.
Right, they're slightly heavier.
Exactly. So in a field experiment, a researcher will select a donor tree. They encapsulate a branch, or sometimes the entire small tree, in a sealed, clear plastic tent.
Okay, so the tree is in a bubble.
Yes. They then pump carbon dioxide gas into the tent that is artificially enriched with carbon-13.
And the tree doesn't care about the extra neutron, right? It just sees carbon dioxide.
Exactly. The tree's natural processes just take over. It breathes in the carbon-13, runs it through photosynthesis, and turns it into carbon-13-laced sugars.
It's literally baking a tracking device into its own food.
Yes. The researchers then wait. Days or weeks later, they take tissue samples from the roots, stems, and leaves of neighboring receiver trees outside the tent.
To see if the tracker showed up.
Right. And they process these samples using a mass spectrometer, an instrument that vaporizes the tissue and separates the atoms based on their mass-to-charge ratio.
So the mass spectrometer acts like a microscopic sorting machine. It can definitively tell you, yes, we found carbon-13 in this neighboring tree.
And because the background levels of carbon-13 in a normal forest are incredibly low and very predictable, finding a spike in the neighbor proves definitively that the carbon physically travels from tree A to tree B. There is no guessing. The carbon moved.
The transfer is a physical reality.
Yes. Now, the critics might argue, yes, the carbon moved, but did it move through the continuous fungal tube, or did tree A just leak carbon into the soil water, and tree B's roots passively drank it up?
Right. The plumbing route is still debatable.
Exactly. But Klein's defense essentially states that while the exact plumbing route might be a valid mechanistic debate, the transfer itself is a proven fact. Dismissing decades of verified transfer events just because of a debate over the specific conduit is throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
That makes a lot of sense. But the most comprehensive, deeply personal defense came from the epicenter of the phenomenon itself, right?
It did. In late 2024 and early 2025, Suzanne Simard, alongside colleagues Ryan and Perry, published a massive point-by-point rebuttal in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change.
And they did not hold back. They accused the critics of fundamentally misrepresenting the scientific record to manufacture a crisis.
Simard's team argued that Karst, Jones, and Hoeksema engaged in severe cherry-picking to make the field look weaker than it is. They pointed out that the critics excluded a vast swath of relevant studies on seedling establishment.
Wait, why would they exclude studies?
Well, the critics demanded pure field studies, arguing that greenhouse pots are too artificial.
Ah, okay.
But Simard is pointing out that nearly all foundational biological discoveries start in controlled lab environments before they can be mapped in the chaotic real world. To dismiss all greenhouse evidence is to dismiss how biology is normally done.
That's a fair point. And the defenders also tackled the mesh barrier critique head-on, didn't they?
Yes, Simard's team highlighted the principle of converging methods. They haven't just relied on plastic mesh bags for 30 years. They have used the isotope tracing we just discussed. They've used advanced DNA sequencing to identify the fungal species. They have used the microsatellite genotyping to map genetic relationships.
Oh, so their argument is really a statistical one. If you use chemistry, genetics, and physical barriers, and all these distinct, independent methods point toward the existence of networks and resource transfer, what are the odds that every single positive result is merely an artifact of a plastic bag?
Exactly. The chance of that kind of systemic mirage across completely different methodologies is statistically minute. Furthermore, Simard emphasized that the critics were enforcing an artificially rigid binary. A forest isn't restricted to using only a fungal network or only soil water. Multiple transfer pathways operate simultaneously. A complex system uses all available routes.
So the defenders feel the critique is this massive overcorrection that conflates the overselling done by documentarians with actual methodological errors in the laboratory.
Precisely.
If we look at this clash objectively, it really feels like a battle over scope. The critics are saying the data is way too thin to support these grand universal laws about forest-wide internet saving babies.
And the defenders are firing back. Our original findings were always framed as context-dependent. We were studying specific temperate Douglas fir systems, not claiming this happens identically in every jungle and taiga on Earth. You are attacking a media caricature of our work.
The tension lies exactly there. But there's one specific sticking point where the laboratory data and the media caricature inextricably intertwine. And that is the very phrase that ignited the cultural phenomenon.
The mother tree.
We have to examine the concept of the mother tree because it wasn't just a journalist's invention, right? It was the title of Simard's own book.
Right.
This brings us to a massive communication dilemma in science, metaphor versus hard evidence. In their defense paper, Simard, Ryan, and Perry directly address the critics' accusation that there is zero field evidence of old trees preferentially feeding their biological kin. So how did the original proponents defend a concept that the audit found entirely unsupported?
They defended it by clarifying their intent. Simard's team stated that the term mother tree was designed as a communication metaphor for the general public.
A metaphor?
Yes. It was a poetic way to describe large, highly connected older hub trees that exert a strong gravitational pull on forest resources. They explicitly stated that mother tree was never intended to be taken as a formal, testable scientific hypothesis of conscious mammalian altruism.
So they weren't claiming the tree has a central nervous system, feels maternal love, or consciously evaluates the genetic makeup of a seedling to feed it at the expense of others.
Precisely. It was an analogy to help people understand a complex hub-and-spoke dynamic.
But this is where the rubber meets the road in public science communication. The critics Karst, Jones, and Hoeksema anticipated this exact defense. In 2023, they published a companion opinion piece in Trends in Ecology and Evolution titled Mother Trees, Altruistic Fungi, and the Perils of Plant Personification.
They argued that deploying human metaphors is actively dangerous to the integrity of the science.
But we have to acknowledge why scientists use these metaphors in the first place, right? You have to balance rigorous scientific auditing with the need to make the public actually care about the research. Like, look at physics. For a century, we have taught school children that an atom is like a tiny solar system with electron planets orbiting a nucleus sun.
Which is physically inaccurate based on quantum mechanics. Electrons exist in probability clouds, not defined orbital tracks.
Right, but the solar system metaphor gives the human brain a scaffolding to picture the invisible. We call DNA a blueprint. We refer to the brain as a computer.
Metaphors make abstract, microscopic, deeply complex systems legible. They make them emotionally resonant to non-experts.
Exactly. If a soil ecologist goes on television and describes bidirectional carbon-13 flux gradients mediated by arbuscular mycorrhizal hyphae and temperate podzolse, the audience changes the channel immediately.
Instant snooze fest.
But if they say trees are talking on an underground internet, suddenly millions of people care about soil conservation. It secures grant funding. It protects forests from clear-cutting.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword. The metaphor sparks the wonder that funds the research. But the peril, as the critics warn, is literalization.
People taking it literally.
Yes. The public, science journalists, and sometimes even young researchers entering the field forget that the metaphor is a poetic placeholder. They begin to literalize it. They start assuming trees genuinely possess conscious intent.
And that influences the science itself.
Absolutely. They begin designing field experiments based on the unspoken assumption of plant morality, looking for data to confirm the mother's love, rather than objectively testing the resource flux.
Wow. When the metaphor hardens into unquestioned fact, that is when the citation bias takes over. That is how the echo chamber is sealed.
It's a feedback loop.
The real challenge for modern scientists is figuring out how to communicate evocative, genuine findings to the public without letting the poetic shorthand replace the actual data.
Yeah, it is a delicate tightrope. You need the metaphor to invite people into the forest, but you need constant, ruthless auditing to ensure the map doesn't replace the territory.
Which leads us to the synthesis of this entire deep dive. The dust has finally settled on the 2023 audit. The reviews have been published. The passionate rebuttals have been filed. What actually survives?
That's the most important question.
If we strip away the book tours, the emotional documentaries, and the media hype, what is the durable core of the science that both the fierce critics and the passionate defenders fundamentally agree on?
A very solid, remarkably profound core remains completely intact. First, mycorrhizal fungi are real, ancient, and ecologically central to life on Earth. The foundational symbiosis between plant roots and fungi is absolute biological fact. No one disputes that.
Number 2, resource transfer between plants. The movement of carbon, water, and nutrients has been unequivocally measured and replicated. Something physical is moving from plant A to plant B.
Yes. And number 3, common mycorrhizal networks do exist. The roots of different trees can absolutely be physically linked by a shared fungal mycelium in certain forests under certain conditions. The wood wide web is not a myth.
So what is contested is simply the interpretive layer built on top of those facts, the assumption of universal ubiquity, the guarantee of seedling benefits, the conscious kin altruism of mother trees.
Exactly. Those are the claims that the critics demonstrated had outrun the field data. And frankly, there are claims that even the defenders now frame with much more caution and nuance than the popular storytelling did.
The meta lesson here, for anyone listening, anyone analyzing scientific news, is that this isn't a story of a beautiful idea being brutally debunked by cynical critics. This is a story of the scientific method working exactly perfectly as designed.
It is literally the immune system of science kicking in.
A beautiful, partly true story got out ahead of its evidence. The public fell in love with it. But the field noticed from the inside. The experts didn't wait for outside journalists to expose a flaw. They audited themselves.
The resulting clash, the intense internal scrutiny over mesh barriers and citation bias, brought the narrative back to the data. Wonder is the engine of discovery. It is what gets a researcher out into the freezing mud with a shovel.
But discipline is the break.
You absolutely need both to arrive at the truth. The friction between wonder and discipline is where actual, durable knowledge is forged. The forest didn't become less interesting because of this audit. By stripping away our human projections, the ecosystem actually became more real.
And on that note, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you navigate the natural world. We started this deep dive by contrasting the old, harsh view of the forest as a cutthroat gladiator arena with the new, beloved view of it as a cooperative, caring human family of mother trees. But what if both of those are just human projections?
We constantly try to force nature to wear our clothes.
Yeah.
We want it to be a capitalist gladiator pit or a socialist utopia.
Right. What if the Wood Wide Web isn't a utopian cooperative society of motherly trees at all? And what if it isn't a purely evil arena either? What if it is something vastly more alien?
A highly complex, neutral, wildly intricate microbial marketplace that defies our human social metaphors entirely.
Exactly. Millions of organisms trading resources based on biochemical gradients, shifting minute by minute in ways we can barely comprehend. Isn't an utterly alien, incomprehensible network actually more fascinating than a forest that just acts like a human family?
I think so.
What if our relentless insistence on making nature look like us is the very thing preventing us from seeing how incredible it truly is?
When you finally drop the human metaphor, you get to see the forest for the trees and the fungi.
Keep diving deep.